we're still needing to have some of those same conversations with government agencies. So we're going to hold off on that bit. We'll share what we did learn. We'll give you an update on the conversations we're having on your behalf based on the requests you made and the questions you raised. And then we're going to spend most of our time today digging into the topic of engaging in public discussions with government and government bodies. Then we'll spend a good amount of time hearing from all of you about what specific questions you would like us to ask additional stakeholders, whether that is individuals you know or groups that you know, and we'll ask you who those folks are so we can start some really robust stakeholder engagement over the next couple of months. The first thing we're going to do, though, is ground ourselves back in the conversations we've had. And to do that, as I frequently do, I'm going to read the charge that we've been given for this subcommittee. This subcommittee is charged with studying and making recommendations on issues to ensure people with disabilities have access to the services they need, are able to effectively participate in public discussion, are able to be employed by government agencies, and can run for and effectively serve in elected positions. So far, we've worked backwards on those topics a little bit. You'll recall that early in the year, we had a conversation about some of the challenges and potential solutions to running for and serving in elected office. On our last conversation, we started talking about what it looks like to be employed by governmental agencies. We're continuing to get answers to some of the questions you all have raised. But with that as our framework and a reminder of the conversations we've had about running for and serving in office and being employed by government agencies, I'd like to go around the subcommittee group and ask for any big takeaways you had from our last conversation. Any things that are particularly high on your list as priorities for us to develop recommendations around either being employed by government agencies or running for and serving in office. Or if there's nothing that fits neatly into those boxes, just the biggest thing that's on your mind when we talk about ensuring Coloradans with disabilities have access to the kind of government services and opportunities that everyone should have. Shannon, you're on the top of my screen, so that means I'm going to call on you first. So I'm going to go to Shannon and then to Craig.
Yes. Yes, thank you, Barry. Yes, this is Shannon. I want to go back to, and I don't know if we talked about this specifically, but I did want to look at specifically government agencies. I know there's recently been some changes, but nothing specific. I believe there was one department back in 2017 that they secured an interpreter and they put limits on the interpretation. That money that was paying for the interpreting services, they didn't come out of the state budget. And so they were trying to figure out how they were going to reduce that during the meeting because they were trying to figure out how to pay for the interpreting services. And so time went on, and then as time went on, I didn't work with them anymore. And then another friend did work in the department, and they said that they aren't doing that anymore. They're switching to CCDHB was the abbreviation for that, but for deaf, hard of hearing, blind. And they got all the budget that was provided for providing sign language interpreting. So they really changed gears, which was good. But it kind of made me pause, because I thought the state has 8 different ways that they'll say, oh, I'm sorry, if there's no money in this budget, then they're looking for the wrong agency to provide money for accessibility for deaf people. So I think that's one of the biggest things. All agencies should be providing and making money for services like interpreting services, all agencies across the board. So that's one thing that I've been thinking about.
Thank you, Shannon. And just so I'm clear, we're talking about an interpreter to support employees in that agency?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
So because the agency was providing interpreters for people that work there. In the past, they would have to pay themselves out of the budget. So they were kind of trying to figure out where the money should come from. And it really, the agency has plenty of money they can use and resources they can use in their budget to be able to pay for the interpreting services for their employees. And that it would force the department to kind of do cuts to be able to find the money to pay for the interpreting services. And so I know it's very specific to interpreting, but I'm just thinking about other things and other people with disabilities, any type of accessibility. Sometimes the department will say, oh, our department has a limited budget and we can't provide whatever that accessibility is. I'm specifically mentioning interpreting, but it could be any accessibility thing in that department and the limited budget that they have. So it shouldn't be that way.
Shannon, I appreciate you bringing that up. And what I'm going to take from that for the research that Carrie and I need to do with our partners at DORA is to find out, number one, about the specific example of interpreters for those who need it and how state government approaches that. We'll also see if we can find out how some different local governments, and I will include as we move into the spring and start developing recommendations and having those conversations, I'll ensure we have a conversation about how different departments or agencies are expected to budget for all types of accommodation. So I really appreciate you raising that.
Yes.
Great.
Thank you. Yeah, that's kind of what's been something that I've been thinking about for the moment. That's kind of what's been on top of mind. So
wonderful. I'm going to go to Craig and then Rob Hernandez.
Hello, everyone. This is Craig, and thank you so much, Shannon. Really appreciate those comments and agree with everything you were saying. And I think for me, I was unable to make the last meeting, unfortunately, so it'll be really helpful to hear everyone else's takeaway from the previous meeting. But top of mind when I think about kind of employment in government agencies, from the first thing that pops into my mind is what Shannon was referring to is effective communication. And included with that is access to appropriate interpreters, whether that be ASL or language interpreters, but also what resources and training is available for more effective communication. Are there plain language versions of handbooks and policies available if requested or needed? Are there access to other technologies such as screen reader technologies and programs such as JAWS for individuals who can use that? And training on that as well, because not everyone is versed on the different types of accessible technology that's out there. And then are there access to large print resources as well as an employee? And then I think about inclusive hiring practices. And then I also think about what is the reasonable accommodation request process like for employees? Is that something that is taught and trained and made sure that it's available to everyone from hiring to people that have been employed for a while? Do they know what that process is like? Do they know what their rights are and what they can request and what that even is to make sure that everyone is being accommodated equally and knows what rights they have? And then included in that, are there kind of equitable and progressive work from home policies now that we have access to remote work and technology such as Zoom? Do people know that that's an option if transportation is an issue or you're more comfortable working remotely? And you're just kind of coming in new to this part of the topic. That's what sticks out to me and kind of is first on mind.
Thank you, Craig. And I'll mention just a couple of things since you missed part of the conversation last time. One of the big questions that we have been able to get an answer for, folks asked, what happens if I check that box saying I do have a disability? Does that affect the consideration of my application? We did have an opportunity to speak with state officials who assured us that that information is entirely screened out or blocked out as part of their hiring process. They have a number of different fields that they black out in the initial resume and application review. So that was one of the questions. The other thing I want to mention is in response to some questions that this group raised on our last conversation, Carrie and I had an opportunity to talk with the senior manager for the Technology Accessibility Program in the Office of Information Technology. And we started getting a basic understanding of what they're rolling out in terms of technology and information accessibility statewide. So we're working with them to get that into a digestible format to have it presented all to this group. Let me go to Rob and then Teresa.
Hi, everyone. This is Rob Hernandez, City of Colorado Springs. So here's where I would start, and let me know if I'm going off path. But the thing is, what I'm noticing in the state of Colorado, and I'm embarrassed to say, because I'm a native here, so I can say it, is our state, for the most part, lacks the education of what the ADA is. And that includes our municipalities. Okay, I was on the governor's council 5 years ago for persons with disabilities. And I did an audit, if you will, of just the state. And I already had an understanding of what the rest of the municipalities in the state were like, city and county government. And I realized, I come to find out that after this evaluation, that they didn't have an ADA program. Okay, well, the law passed in 1990, and it requires you to develop and implement an ADA program. And when you do that, you hire an ADA coordinator. The ADA coordinator, by guidelines of the DOJ, should be trained, educated, trained, and they prefer that that person is certified. So from that point on, you have a process where you have to post notices. You have to post grievance procedures. You have to do a self-evaluation of your entity. So for instance, City of Colorado Springs, I had to evaluate the entire city. Okay, what am I evaluating for? I'm evaluating the way I was put, the ADA is a pie. And that pie is 8 slices, let's just say. The ADA is huge, okay, because it pertains to every part of life, if you think about it. So one slice of the pie, I call effective communication. Well, think about this. Effective communication is web accessibility. So that is just a sliver of that slice of that pie, which right now we have House Bill 211110, which I'm working with. I've been working with the state quite a bit on that. Matter of fact, they hired my web accessibility coordinator to help with the House rules. And so then you have looping, then you have ASL, you have captioning, but you have video phones, right? TTY, that's just effective communication. Then you have accessibility to services and programs. Okay, can you participate in an activity at a park, right? Are there components where someone can enjoy the same experience? Are the restrooms accessible? Do you have elevators if you don't have access to a certain level? It includes everything you can imagine, from the web, which is the cyber part, to physical, curb ramps, sidewalks. So that's what we've done. We've evaluated the entire city. We have a 26,000 page transition plan. Okay, it's broken down into phases. It took us 3.5 years to effectively do this. Okay, with that, we know what our dirty laundry is. The DOJ expects you to evaluate yourself, tell the public what your issues are, and how you're going to fix it. That's the problem. All these municipalities, in order to get what we're asking for here, they need to be educated to begin with. Okay, once we complete that process, we have a transition plan, then you can start, policies and procedures, education and training, committees, and you're able to focus on every question that comes about and effectively be able to answer and come up with solutions to mitigate, right? To remove those barriers. And the thing is, the most important thing is, in understanding this process, universal design, inclusiveness, good faith effort, maximum extent feasible, those are all ADA words that we use daily. That you have to understand the ADA if you're going to be able to help the process.
Thank you, Rob. And I so appreciate your big picture and down to the micro level thoughts on that. For me, you surfaced things that are going to hit on a couple of our topics today and our work over the next few months. And Shannon, I do see your hand up, so I'll call on you in just 1 second. I just want to remark that as I'm listening to Rob, I hear a few things. I hear number one, that we may want to talk later this spring as we start developing recommendations about what could be improved to provide that education and that awareness across government agencies and government bodies. Two, I think you may want to also talk about what we do to ensure compliance with that. And then one of the topics we'll be discussing today is whose opinion, perspective, and experience we need to go survey or bring to this group. So it may be, Rob, I'm thinking we may need to talk to people in a variety of government offices about what their knowledge is about the ADA, what their knowledge is about CADA and other state requirements. So you offered a whole host of thoughts, and you actually answered a number of the questions we want to tackle. So I'm just trying to kind of put those into buckets, and I see as Harry's taking notes. Let me bring Shannon in, and then I'm going to go to Teresa.
You're muted, Kim.
Thank you. Sorry. I was talking away and my microphone was muted. Sorry about that. This is Shannon. And I just wanted to add one thing that I think is very important as well, is for the interview process as well. From the first steps of filling out the application, answering all the questions, most of struggles happen within the interview. That's where the bias happen. Often a person, while they're in an interview, they look at the resume, everything looks great. And then at the interview, it's awkward for them because the process feels a little awkward. And then maybe they don't end up hiring the person who has a disability, even though they have all of the qualifications, because the interviewer themselves is not prepared. So it doesn't matter if they have the skills or the knowledge, experience, or anything, they have to be able to feel like they can manage the interview. And I think that that's where personal bias comes in. And I don't know how we'll be able to analyze that, that individual interview skill. And how they manage that with the disabilities that are involved. It's a bias. And so how do we remove that bias during a face-to-face interview? So I think that's something that is a big struggle for a lot of us. I don't know, I could be wrong, but.
I appreciate you raising that, Shannon. And what I'm going to do is we're going to come back in about 5 minutes, and I'm going to ask the group to workshop with you and with me, and as a group, what some of the solutions may be to that. Craig, I see your hand up. I haven't gotten Teresa in yet. Did you have something directly related to what we were just talking about, or can I come back to you?
This is Craig. You can come back to me. Just when Shannon was speaking about the interview process, something popped into my head. But we can come back.
All right, hold on to that thought so I don't make you lose it, and we're going to come back and talk about that. Teresa, if you're with us, what has been on your mind or your takeaways from our conversation, either about being employed by government and working in government, or our earlier conversation about running for office?
Thanks. Hi, everybody. I'm off camera. This is Teresa, due to health reasons. I've missed, I believe, the last meeting or 2 meetings. And so it's good to get grounded in everybody's comments. I will say I have a couple additional comments that maybe could help lead our discussion later. But in terms of being employed, by the government as a disabled person, I think we often forget that the process starts before the employment begins, in terms of ensuring accessibility. And so I think that's really important to consider in terms of, are these accessibility measures and accommodations in place from the very beginning to even enable somebody to go interview or to participate in other required events prior to being employed. I think that's really important. I also think that while we're on the topic of just being employed by the government and on the topic of just having access prior to, if folks in each department are looking to engage stakeholders from the disability community, I also think it's important to ensure accessibility in that arena too. And so kind of in the same vein of, the process of employment begins before the job offer, the opportunity to even interact with your governmental agency as a disabled person should be considered across all entities as well. I hope that makes sense.
It absolutely does. Thank you. And I'm not going to put you on the spot immediately, but I will tell you, I'm going to go to Craig, and then I'm going to come back to you with a follow-up question, because what I want to start doing is picking up on this issue that Shannon raised, Craig flagged, and now Teresa, you've spoken to, of ensuring accessibility isn't just about an application or once somebody's in the job. So Craig, I would love your thoughts on that interview process. And then Teresa, I'm going to invite you to come in after Craig and speak to, I'm very focused on us not just identifying problems and sitting around a table admiring these ugly problems. I want us to identify the solutions to them. So Craig, I'd love your thoughts on what would be a better system to ensure accessibility and comfort and equity throughout the interview process and into that onboarding into a new position. And then Teresa, I'll invite you to offer some thoughts on the same.
Thank you. This is Craig. To speak to that, this is actually what popped into my mind as Shannon and Teresa were talking about the inclusivity of the interview process and also the application process, and also even before all that, even feeling comfortable taking an interview or wanting to apply for a government position. I think a solution to help with kind of inclusive hiring practices would to really show value for lived experience and give that credit on a resume when applying for these jobs, to really show that our experiences as people with disabilities in our community are a value add, not a takeaway from these positions. And I think it's really important too to not necessarily just redact on a application that someone has a disability so there's no discrimination. But for example, for independent living centers, we actively recruit from disability communities, and we welcome people with disabilities to apply. And we put that in the wording when we're actually recruiting and sending out job posts, because we want to encourage people from our community to apply for our organizations. And I think through that type of inclusive recruiting, it's really important to highlight that we're looking for and valuing diversity of thought in our community. And that kind of shows that we want everyone to apply for these jobs. And it's not just that we won't discriminate against you because you have a disability, but we will encourage you to apply because you do, and because we value that diversity of thought and know that your lived experience will be a value add to the position that you're applying for. And that's how we're going to encourage people to apply for these positions, especially within the government, by showing that we're valued and the experiences that we have through our lived experiences are going to be kind of a value add at the end of the day and make you a more ideal candidate because of that. And I think that's going to be a really important step we take for truly inclusive hiring practices.
Craig, let me keep you on screen and off of mute for a minute here. What would that look like in an interview process? I'm intrigued by the suggestions you made on the application about inviting, and I'll make sure we continue that conversation. I'm curious, what would be some best practices, whether that's trainings or the approach to interviews that continued that welcoming environment?
I think an important interview question would be just to share a story of how you've overcome adversity in your life and how that relates to the position you're applying for. And to be able to really show how lived experience is a benefit to any kind of job opportunity that's out there, and the unique experiences and adversity that we face as people with disabilities and overcoming challenges can really be highlighted as a value add by having the opportunity to share those experiences. And you're invited to share those experiences when the interview asks you about lived experience. And it's sometimes not always phrased as that, but if an interviewer has a question that says, please share lived experience about your life and how that applies to this job, and not just make it purely kind of what's written on a CV or application, and kind of takes it more person-centered, I think is really important.
Thank you. Teresa, I'm going to get to you in just a minute. I'm going to give you another minute to think about this question of the interview process from the application through the interview and the onboarding. What would a better system look like? I think everybody knows that all of our recommendations from this subcommittee will ultimately go up to the executive committee of the task force, which for a lot of people has been this invisible group that meets outside of us. They're very interested in this work, and we have a member of the committee or of the task force on this call, Elizabeth Moran. So, Ms. Moran, I want to give you the opportunity to say hello if you'd like. We've still got you on mute, Elizabeth. There we go.
There we go. Thanks, Barrick. Elizabeth Moran from the ARC of Colorado here. I serve on the executive committee for the Governor's Disability Rights Task Force, and happy to just be here. If you can use me as a resource, I love that you're all talking about effective communication. It's something near and dear to my heart. I'd like to see more of Title II and III enforced, particularly in engagement in any kind of a government entity or activity. And I'll just leave it at that, and I'm going to go back to being a fly on the wall. Thanks.
Thank you for joining us. Appreciate it. Teresa, I'm going to go to you, and then I will open it to Rob or Shannon if you'd like to jump in our last 10 minutes or so of this topic around employment, and then I'm going to move us into accessing public discussion. But Teresa, you mentioned the process and the interviews and the onboarding. What do you think would be some ideas that this group should consider, should learn more about, or should discuss that would make it a more accessible process for somebody to go through that application and interviewing and hiring cycle?
Thanks. This is Teresa. Gosh, there's so many things in each step of the process. I will say, kind of piggybacking on what Craig is saying, that it all starts with job posting and how inclusive the language is there, in terms of, welcoming, encouraging XYZ to apply. Sorry about that. That was my dog. And I would say, in the interview process, it would be very helpful to just be mindful of the different methods that the interview can take part in. So, for example, if the position is possibly remote, maybe conduct the interview in a remote setting or a virtual setting to increase accessibility, and or providing kind of different formats for materials as well, I think is really important. So plain language, interview questions. I have seen many positions kind of distribute the interview questions beforehand to make things more accessible so folks can process and supply their responses in a more prepared format. I don't know, big text. There's so many things that I can name in terms of tangible things that we can do. I think something that is easy and maybe sounds really obvious to this group, but I don't see it often, is just making sure the building is like enterable by people with disabilities. So does it have a ramp? Does it have power doors? Is there a way to get a hold of somebody if you're trying to enter the building? That kind of thing. Again, if you can't even interface with the governmental entities, there's no way that I would consider a job in a governmental department if I didn't have a relationship with them beforehand. I also appreciate, so I have held several positions in Colorado government departments here, and I really appreciate when the employer, per se, at the interview kind of leads and initiates the conversations about accommodations needed. I'm fully prepared to go into that conversation talking about it, but that's just my personality, and you can't guarantee every disabled person to just have that initiative based on their experiences and their identity and pride. And so just having the employer take that on as just, again, an open, transparent practice, I thought was really cool in some of my experiences as well. And lastly, when we talk about ADA coordinators and other folks who can ensure accessibility in our entities, I think it's helpful that we can assume, I would say, that many ADA coordinators maybe don't have lived experience. I've not seen one in my time in the state. And so I would say the next best thing is to make it a best practice to consult with somebody with lived experience when they are onboarding, considering hiring a disabled person.
Some great perspectives and ideas there. Thank you very much, Teresa. We'll capture these, and this is all going to become part of our conversation as we shared a couple months ago. Right now, we're brainstorming to identify the barriers and the needs for change. And then as we go into late spring and summer, we're going to start bringing all of these together to identify the recommendations you all would like to make about how to improve the system. Shannon or Rob, anything either of you would like to offer on this question we've been delving into about how can government hiring bodies or offices make the process more welcoming and more fair, more accessible? Rob, let me go to you first. I see your hand up.
Okay, yeah, you know, what Teresa talked about, she hit it right on the mark. Agree with what she said. That's just it. Again, it starts from the very beginning. And like she said, that she has not ran into ADA coordinators with the knowledge that they need to have. And I said that they need the education, the training, the certification, and well, most of all, the experience, right? But the thing is, if you don't have that, then how can you change the culture? How can you educate and train the rest of the municipality or the corporation? So that's one of the things I run into right now. I receive an average of 3 to 5 emails or calls from across the state of Colorado weekly from new ADA coordinators. And what I'm finding is that they don't have a clue. But that's good that they're reaching out to try to figure out, where do I start, right? And they don't realize what they've taken on until I start explaining. I take the time out of my schedule. I schedule time. I start explaining. I start with the history of the ADA, what's required, why it's required, where you should be, and how you're going to get there, right? And then they realize, wow, this is a huge pie. And that's just it. I run into that, like Teresa said, all the time. And it's good that the tension is starting to be created across the state, because the thing is, it starts with that. And then the job of that ADA group, like I have a team, a great team. And my job, I told my team, is we need to change the culture. If we change the culture of the city, then guess what? It becomes second nature. So now we have lots of people working here at the city with disabilities. I'm one of them. I'm a disabled veteran, okay? And with invisible disabilities, maybe some not so invisible, but the thing is, the culture that's critical. But you can't change the culture if you don't know how to change it. And that's with education training, by starting with the program.
Thank you, Rob. I'm hearing some pretty clear themes and common threads here. Shannon, you get the last thoughts on this for today's discussion. We will obviously continue this, but your thoughts on how do we make applying, interviewing, hiring, onboarding more accessible, more equitable, more welcoming?
Yes, this is Shannon. Two things that I'm kind of thinking about, and I don't know if this is a great idea or not. I'm just kind of spitballing here, but You know, if we can desensitize, I guess, it's almost like breaking down the shock, the initial shock that happens when you initially meet someone and they, you know, discover that you're disabled and you start that process. That way you can feel a little more connected during the interview. A lot of times on paper, people don't realize you have all the credentials that are required, but it's not the full story, right? It's just your resume. It's not until you meet in person that people really kind of get an understanding. And you kind of try to go through this process of, you know, doing the interview. And then at that point, you kind of go through the logistics and specifics, right? And then it becomes a natural conversation during the interview. It doesn't feel quite so overwhelming. Like you said, the culture, changing the culture. People don't understand what that even looks like and how to connect with people with disabilities and how to change that, and how to change that mindset and what that even looks like. They don't deal or talk with people that have disability on a daily basis. And how we improve that is that department actually needs to be a part of the disability community. They need to get involved. They need to ask questions and they need to see what the issues are and learn from that. And then bring that back to their department. And that's how we change the culture. That's how we make an impact on changing the culture.
I love that. Thank you, Shannon. Craig, your thoughts?
This is correct. Yes, it just made me think what Shannon was saying is we need to really work on the destigmatization of the disability community. And that's kind of what has that initial kind of, as Shannon said, the shock of the interviewee that doesn't really take place until you meet them in person. And that's through the culture change from the very beginning and making sure that the interviewees or the interviewers are properly changed and have been exposed to people with disabilities through disability etiquette training, understand the community that they're working with and interviewing. And then also I was thinking a lot about just the importance of inclusive language and understanding, you know, just how you're spoken to it through by an interviewer. And if they know to use person first language, for example, during the interview, that shows that they've gone through the process of learning what that is and the importance of that to the community. And so just those, as everyone's alluded to, Rob and Shannon and Teresa, just the culture change of the hiring body needs to understand the disability community and show that inclusivity through the little things. And that makes all the difference at the very beginning of the process.
Thank you, Craig. I'm going to pivot us to a new topic with the repeat that we are not done with this conversation. We've had the initial surfacing of the challenges and some of the ideas. We're capturing all of this, and we are going to come back at future meetings to not only provide you with responses to some of the questions you've raised and some exemplars of what could be done. We'll also talk later today about who else we want to hear from, but we'll come back later this spring to start really developing the recommendations you'd like to make. As I started off reading our charge, we have about 5 areas we have to look at. One that we've talked about has been running for office. Now we've talked about what it looks like to apply for and work in government. Excuse me, we have 4. We have 2 more areas. The next that we're going to spend some time on is what does it mean to be able to effectively participate in public discussions? Our final topic that we'll get into at our next meeting is going to be about ensuring that people with disabilities have access to the services they need from government offices. But for today's conversation, I want to talk about this very specific task we've been given about making recommendations to ensure that Coloradans with disabilities are able to effectively participate in public discussion. As we have with everything else, I'm going to invite you to think about public discussion very, very broadly. That could mean testifying on a piece of legislation at the Colorado State Capitol. That could mean participating in a county commission meeting in your local town or county. It could mean a town hall, whether held online or in person by one elected official or by a government office or agency. So I'd invite you to think about public discussion as broadly as possible, including but in no way limited to what I just laid out. And as we've done in the past in these conversations, I'm going to invite you to offer something that is currently a barrier. And then I'm going to ask everybody in the subcommittee to offer some thoughts on what would be a solution or a better condition. So rather than calling anybody, I'll ask if anybody would like to volunteer to identify what is a barrier to being able to effectively participate in government public discussions. Rob, jump in. What's one of the barriers?
Okay, Rob Hernandez, City of Colorado Springs. So, you can't just say, well, you can, one of the barriers, but you have to look at the big picture here. If you're gonna have a public meeting, you have to look at, are there any barriers? It could be a physical barrier. So if you're gonna have a meeting, an open forum, let's say a neighborhood meeting, right? And it's gonna affect your neighborhood. So this is the state or the city having a neighborhood meeting because of a development project, right? And it's gonna affect you, right? Or it could be another type of meeting, a town hall meeting to talk about an ordinance or whatever. One, you got to look at the big picture, or again, inclusiveness, right? Can the person get there? Meaning, okay, if it's on the second floor, there's no elevator, and you use a wheelchair or even a walking aid, well, you didn't think that out. Okay, you have to think that inclusion. Okay. Two, is the person going to be required to have sign language interpretation, right? Okay, and there's a process. When you advertise that, you should be thinking ahead. You should have a statement on there stating, an ADA statement on there stating, if you need a reasonable accommodation because of such and such, please notify this office. And you should provide email, phone number, QR code, however. You can't just provide one way of, you got to be open to several different options. And then they could request an ASL interpreter. They could request an LAP for limited English proficiency, right? You gotta, what if there's somebody that's Spanish speaking, limited on English, and they require Spanish SL? I'm not sure what they call that, Shannon, right? But probably SSL, I don't know. But you gotta look at that big picture. Do maybe require captioning, right? What if the person is hard of hearing? Okay, think about the venue. Is there a request? Look at maybe having it at a venue that's looped for persons wearing hearing aids that have that ability to use a T-coil. If not, do you have the means to provide that? So here at the city, we have two portable systems, one big portable system and a smaller portable system. And then we have 11 different venues that are looped, and we're doing that more. But you got to look at all those areas to make sure. Okay, last thing I'll say is there's a public, I don't know if you're aware or not, but there is a House bill that's being proposed, 23-1168, public speaking, which I've had the pleasure to provide input on that. And the purpose of that is what we're talking about right now. And I think that is it's being headed up by Representative Ortiz. And the thing is, this is going to take it further because you know how we use virtual technology right now, as we are, okay? What if you're having this at a certain venue, but I have a disability and I can't get to that venue, right? I should be able to participate. So there should be a process where it's live, where I can participate like this and provide the captioning and ASL as needed. Those are things that I'll end with.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to pick up with where you started us. And rather than trying to identify individual barriers, I am going to separate us out into the format of the conversation and have one conversation about in-person or brick and mortar location-based meetings and opportunities for discussion. And then after we talk about that, we'll talk about remote or virtual participation, understanding that at the intersection of those two are probably some of the solutions, is offering one of them. And we will get everybody a copy of the bill that's been introduced on virtual participation. I need to emphasize that our committee is not taking any positions on any piece of legislation, but it does intersect. But let's drill into in-person meetings. And we will talk in a couple of months of which ones should be legally required, what are best practices that you would recommend. But let's just talk about what would be good, what would be better, what would be the best thing to ensure every Coloradan with any disability can fully participate in an in-person meeting. And Rob started surfacing some of those. And obviously they go to the physical access, they go to addressing those people with need for that have visual impairment or listening impairments. But let's go into what do you think are some of these specific things? And I see everybody's hands now up. So I'm going to go to Teresa and Craig and Shannon in that order.
This is Teresa. I think a big, huge improvement would be starting at the communications level. How is the opportunity presented to the public, and can all Coloradans access that? And so I would say that, an accessible way to communicate that this meeting is open for all folks is to really just ensure that there is a place to request accommodations or an individual to talk to if you need to participate in a very different or unique way. And so I think it starts with communications. And we often don't think a lot about how disability can be impacted through how we communicate things to the public, but I think it's a place to start. Can folks fully understand what the opportunity is? So is the language easy to understand? And do folks understand that they have a right to request accommodations to fully participate? Those are things that I think would be awesome. Let's see. In addition to that, I think I've discussed just the basic access to the literal building. Again, if I or my community tells me, oh my gosh, I've been to that building, it was really hard to get into and it's just not worth it for me, I'm not going to go and I'm not going to participate or engage. And so making sure whoever you need to have on board to make sure that the public comment opportunity is accessible is important. I would say a lot of the times those are, people with lived experience kind of helping to plan some of these events or public comment opportunities. I think that helps a lot. And it also, I think, builds trust in the community to engage in a meaningful way. So I can stop there and see what other folks have to say.
And I'd actually like to ask you a follow-up question. You started mentioning, you raised some questions that should be asked. Like, do people know about the meeting? Is it presented in an accessible way? Do they know they have the right to ask for accommodations? I don't want to assume anything or project into your thinking. So I would love for you to offer some suggestions on how should those questions be answered. So rather than me asking, do people have the knowledge that they can ask for these things? What should a government body or official who is hosting a meeting be expected to do to ensure those things you're asking are known and are available?
Yeah, I would say that, sorry, this is Teresa. I would say that, government employees should be able to explain the event in pretty plain language. And I will say this is actually really beneficial to all folks in the state. Not many people understand really complex legislation that is happening, or, bills that are being proposed. And especially, I'm thinking about folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We need increased participation from that community in general, in public comment events. And so I would say that the department should be able to explain the event in a pretty simple way, explain the expectations of the public comment participation requirements, and then also communicate very clearly that, again, it's an inclusive environment and they are ready to hear what accommodations people need. This could be via social media or an email out to the listservs that folks belong to regarding a certain situation or issue in the state. I have seen it done, and I've seen it done well, and I've also seen it done like pretty bad. And so I don't know. If you want more specifics, I'm happy to let you know, but I know teams have hired specific people with lived experience for this reason, kind of building the relationships with the disability community to better engage, to better ensure access to some of their public facing events. So that's one tangible solution. But, if that's not possible, if hiring additional staff are not possible, then they should be prepared to have these things in mind themselves.
That is fantastic. And I won't push you more right now. I will ask you to lock in the back of your brain. You made a mention that you've seen it done well and you've seen it done poorly. Part of the stakeholder engagement we are going to be asking you all to help us do is to ask people to share their stories, to share their experiences with all of you. So I'm going to ask everybody to keep Teresa's note in mind about when you've seen it done well, when you've seen things done poorly, and think about who we would want to invite to share their stories. And that doesn't mean joining this call. We're going to do everything from some online forums to opportunities for people to submit their stories. And we want to make sure we surface both those exemplars of things being done well and those stories where it just wasn't what was needed and people deserve better. Craig, you had your hand up, it went down. Is that because I took so long, or because did you want to jump in?
Oh, I put my hand. Oh, this is Craig. I put my hand down because you had given the order of the next
Okay,
people talking,
please.
so I figured.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. Let's go to Craig and then Shannon.
Okay, thank you. This is Craig. And yeah, I just wanted to, I was thinking the exact same thing that Teresa was saying, pretty much right on spot, with really the importance of understanding the topics that are being discussed. And if we really want to encourage diverse participation, work needs to be done to help inform and educate the broader community about the issues that are being discussed, and provide that information in really accessible formats and plain language versions, so that it can be distributed through networks that have connections to the communities by utilizing the networks already in place through community partnerships and the use of cultural brokers to help have a trusted source distributing the information about these events to their community members, and then also providing it in accessible versions so that we can be educated about the topics being discussed, to actually show up and talk about them and feel prepared. So there needs to be work done prior to these public meetings to make sure that not only people are getting the information about when they exist and knowing that they're accessible and can participate in that way, but also understanding what is being discussed, the policies, the legislation, and all that being presented in accessible formats, in multiple formats ahead of time, so that we can feel prepared to speak on these issues. And if someone isn't prepared or fully understands what's being talked about, it's going to be really hard to encourage active participation on a public level.
I so appreciate Craig and Teresa, both of you, emphasizing that no matter how accessible we make a meeting, if all of the background work and facts and information that led up to that meeting aren't equally accessible, that meeting being accessible doesn't really mean much. So I appreciate you highlighting that. Shannon, your thoughts, and again, we're talking about physical in-person meetings, what are the things that would make them accessible, that would make them really welcoming from everything your colleagues here have talked about to the meeting itself and maybe the follow-up from the meeting?
Yeah, so hold on just one second. I can't see him all the way. Just one sec. Sorry. Thank you. Thank you for everything that you guys all said. I had a point to support with Rob, what Rob had said, and a question that he brought up, and I thought of an easy fix for whoever is in charge of the event. It's easy to have a list of what they need to do, and so that the list can be standard, so they know what is required when you're putting on a public event. So a list of who do we need to talk to? Who's the first choice? Who's the second choice if that first person isn't available, so that we can allow accessibility to all people. Like a checklist, I think would be helpful. And also the theme of the event, I think. So if there's a legislative meeting about a bill that's been proposed and we request an interpreter ahead of time, and there's an interpreter that shows up at the last minute, or the meeting is at the last minute, it's hard to prepare the interpreter to have an interpreter, but also have the interpreter have the expectation and ability to prepare themselves. So I think that that's also another accommodation that becomes a barrier. The concept of access to the meeting, who the people that are hosting the meetings don't always know everything, so I don't really blame them, but I think that a checklist will come in handy for that, to be able to make it standard and help people that don't really have a lot of experience knowing what they have to do, what's expected and required of them, give them an outline to follow, and I think it will help things be more successful. Craig mentioned the bill and having knowledge about the bill before the meeting, prior knowledge to the meeting, so that we can go in as participants being prepared, so that when we do get to the meeting, we can know what's expected and be prepared to ask questions. I support and agree with that as well. You know, because instead of just going and expecting that they're going to do all the work for us, we can prepare ourselves to go too. And I think that was a great idea as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Shannon. Teresa, heads up. I'm going to go to you first with this question. Actually, it looks like Craig wants to jump in. So, Craig, I'll let you come into the conversation, and then I'm going to pivot us to virtual meetings and hybrid meetings. But, Craig, your thoughts.
This is Craig, and sorry, this will be real quick, but I just wanted to add really quickly to what Shannon was saying. Is one was with the accessibility checklist. We, as an organization, we've created those before to provide to different organizations putting on events to help with accessibility and planning. And I'd be happy to share that to use as an example to build upon. And then also for the last part, Shannon, is with that, I think sometimes the overcomplication, especially of bills, is sometimes intentional to prevent people and dissuade people from active participation. And I think that is used as a tactic. And I think it's understood in the disability community that that is a tactic, and why it's so important to help change this and make it no longer a way to prevent people from actively participating because of misunderstandings. So I think it's important to understand that there's a lot that, yeah, just to know that it can be a tactic, and we need to combat that through using correct language and creating resources so that there's an effort by government agencies to create that trust that we are trying to inform our public equally to have active participation, and not creating things that are over technical and intentionally misleading to sometimes dissuade people from participating. And I think that's really important in building trust and encouraging active participation.
Thank you, Craig. And Craig, if you would send to Carrie or me that checklist that you developed, We would love to put it into a online folder of resources for this group. I probably should not comment on whether legislators and bureaucrats make things more complicated intentionally, as I facilitate one of the task forces they created. But I think all of you make good points about plain language and the accessibility of what is meant and all of the jargon that can get in there. Let's pivot for the next 10 minutes or so and build on this for virtual meetings. And I'm building into this an expectation that some of the things you all have raised, like making information accessible and available in advance, is critical here as well. But I'd love for you to share your thoughts. And Teresa, I'm coming to you first, and then we'll go around the whole group. What are specific considerations to virtual meetings, whether they're video Zoom meetings like this, or telephone town halls, or other forms of virtual engagement and participation? And what are some things that would make all of these virtual formats more accessible?
This is Teresa. I think something that has helped me kind of better participate in virtual opportunities is like general housekeeping that is reminded to folks at the beginning of the meeting. And I think the housekeeping, whatever they are, because I'm sure each team has their own kind of set, but should also include some accessibility reminders, such as some that are actually practiced here, which is stating our name before we speak, describing images if we're sharing them on screen, and or just ensuring that folks have increased opportunity to participate, like in the chat if they desire. I think that when we do things virtually, we really need to really think about our blind and low vision participants, and really just make it an expectation for presenters, and I'm going to assume that that's on the governmental side, to really keep in mind, again, describing things a little bit better, verbalizing what is on the screen for folks. So if they're, sharing text or whatnot, just kind of, again, reading through those so that everybody kind of knows where the meeting is going and can follow along. Kind of similar recommendations, information about who to contact if you need accommodations to participate virtually is important. Some cool things about virtual participation is that if it is a video call, most platforms now can enable captioning, and that's just a simple accommodation. And so, anything that is kind of built into technology, we should take advantage of as a state to ensure full participation of everybody. And then again, there are going to be accommodations where folks need to request in advance for. And so again, having a contact to be able to talk to and describe what you need is really important as well. And then same with before, materials being provided in advance in different formats. If people need to, again, fully participate is another recommendation.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go around the full group, and I'm going to go Shannon, and then Rob, and then Craig. And just to repeat, my question to you is, thinking specifically about all forms of virtual public discussions hosted or arranged by government, what are some things that should be consistently on that checklist of this is what you need to do to maximize the accessibility? Shannon, your thoughts?
Yes. Hello, this is Shannon. I think more specifically to Zoom, but really there's a couple things. And again, I'm speaking for myself as a deaf person. I don't know if this is applicable to hearing people, but oftentimes deaf people, this will happen where, let's say, like we have an interpreter right now. If no one's available, if the interpreter doesn't show, like there's dial-in, which is another way that people can, access the information. If the company has a dial-in option, and then if the meeting, like if they turn off certain features, you only have the option to dial in. So I'm already excluded from the meeting, right? So making sure that all formats are available, and if there's a backup plan, that's always, important. And then also, accessibility. If you're talking about deaf culture, typically, like if you, for example, are aware that, not all interpreters are equally qualified for all settings. So if an agency or department or government body hires an interpreter, and if that interpreter, they keep using the same interpreter, isn't qualified, that's an issue. They don't know how to kind of gauge who and which interpreter is qualified for what. So that often happens where if I'll let them know in advance, I'll say, well, what agency are you getting the interpreters from? Deaf people are very much aware of the, the interpreter agencies that are out there. And they'll say, well, why do you ask? We already have the interpreter arranged. And I'll say, well, no, we want to know if these interpreters are coming from an agency that hires qualified interpreters. And we want to make sure that we give you enough advance so we can get a qualified interpreter. And so that often that back and forth kind of happens, but that's a cultural thing, and that's kind of complex to figure out how to hire an interpreter that's qualified. And it's not always black and white for these agencies. So
Thank you, Shannon. Rob, your thoughts on some best practices or things that need to be done differently, intentionally, to make virtual meetings accessible?
You know, it's really, I think Craig, Shannon, Teresa, they've covered, they've did a great job talking about this. The checklist comes to mind. We use checklists. We have a thing called Rob Hernandez, City of Colorado Springs. Sorry about that. We have a team called Special Events Team, and it's comprised of the police department, the fire department, and the parks department, and Office of Accessibility, right? Which covers ADA and language. So we have checklists for all that. So when there's a special event and somebody, even from the public, wants to have a special event, and we're condoning this, we're looking at, okay, well, are you making sure that you're not discriminating, right? So part of our checklist or part of our process, we provide a checklist, in-depth ADA special events checklist, and they have to meet all the requirements. You got to look at it from A to Z. Are there restrooms that are accessible? Because if you're going to go to an event, right, it would be nice to be able to use a restroom if you have to, right? Or can you access the venue if they're having tables and things like that? If it's in the grass, well, that's not accessible. You have to think that out. And I'm just giving examples, okay? But it's not always just going to be a facility, right? It could be out in the open outdoors. You have to look at that. Is parking available, right? Is access, path of travel available? Okay. And then, like I said, participating to be able to see what's going on. It could be a fair. It could be, there's several different types of fairs that, that go on. So the checklist is a big deal, okay? And that's where you cover all these different areas. If it's at a facility and you're given a formal presentation, captioning, ASL interpretation, looping, all those things you have to keep in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Craig, anything you would add primarily to virtual, but to any of these questions about best practices for these meetings?
Thank you. This is Craig. I think a lot has been covered really thoroughly, and I agree with a lot. A couple things that I was still thinking about that have been alluded to, and I think needs to be training that is available just on the very basics of how to use these online platforms, because I think there's been a lot of assumption that people have these skills already and that we can pivot really quickly to using them. And I think that leaves a lot of people behind who might not have that underlying knowledge and training on how to use these platforms just to begin with. And I think that's something that can't be overlooked. And we can't have the assumption that everyone is coming in and can just use Zoom if they need to and have that option. It's a great option, but we really have to meet people where they're at and understand that not everyone has that training from the beginning. And if we really want to have truly, inclusive practices, we need to understand that and offer trainings to these community members that need that to help get them on a level playing field to have this access. And then I think it's also important with that is to have consistency with the platforms that are used. For example, we're using Zoom here, but with our cities and counties, we always use Microsoft Teams. And then for other ones, we're using Google Meets. And each one has different accessibility features, different captioning, different layout of buttons, different interfaces, different accessibility features with voice to text or screen readers, and it all works a little bit different. So we have to understand that consistency is important too to help with the training. And then also to start from the very ground level with access is we have to make sure that people have the technology, that people have laptops, that people have tablets, that people have high-speed internet, especially in our rural communities, to make sure that there are avenues for people to acquire the technology to actually access these things before we're making the assumption everyone can use it, but you need to have the actual tools and the training on those before you can access a virtual meeting. So I think we need to really be thinking about all this simultaneously when trying to think of truly inclusivity and accessibility.
I really appreciate that, Craig. And I think it pushes our thinking beyond these technical pieces that we can check off. Well, we have an interpreter, we have closed captioning. Are those things even accessible and usable to everybody? So I appreciate you bringing us back to some of the very basic things to consider. This is part one of this conversation on accessing public discussions. We wanted to start this initial brainstorm. Craig, I'm going to follow up with you and see if we can't get that checklist. Rob, I'd love to follow up with you and understand how you down there approach some of this. Carrie and I have captured notes, and we're going to follow up to bring even more information back to a next part of the discussion about public discussions. It is 4:15. We've got about 15 minutes to go. I do want to name, because we are being live streamed on YouTube, folks may be watching this later because it's recorded and archived. Normally, we would be going to public discussion and inviting public comment at this time. We don't have any members of the public on, which means I get to continue talking with all of you. You do see a number of other folks on here. You heard from Elizabeth, who is on the executive committee of the task force. You have a representative from the Lieutenant Governor's office, Josh Winkler. You have several members from the Civil Rights Division and members from the Department of Regulatory Agencies who support all of this, but no members of the public. Just a lot of folks from government interested in supporting all of this, which means I'm going to use the next 10 minutes for our other topic of conversation, and that's stakeholders. And I get a little tired of that word. It's impersonal. I want to talk about people. I want to talk about individuals with experience and perspectives. And in particular, on these last three topics we've talked about at our meetings: participating in public discussions, applying and working in government, running for and serving in elected office. Who would you like us to go solicit the stories from, the opinions from? We will create some draft questions for things like surveys or focus groups or prompts for people to share stories, and we'll have all of you help us shape those. But I'd love to go around the room and get ideas from you if there are certain communities, organizations, or outlets you have where you could share an invitation for people to share their stories or share their opinions on some specific questions. And as I've done up until now, rather than call somebody first, I'll let somebody raise their hand first, and then I'll go around the circle, whoever is closest on my screen. But who would like to offer some thoughts on whose experiences, whose stories would you like to hear to inform our recommendations on these challenges you've identified? Rob is fastest, getting his hand up, which means my order will go Rob, Shannon, Craig, and Teresa. simply because that's going around the circle on my screen. Rob, the floor is yours.
So I'll be brief. Really, I think who do we want to hear? I think the people we want to hear are the people that live the persons with disabilities that live the fight every day, right? That they have to deal with these issues. Who better to explain when they know what it's like? That's why in the ADA, the DOJ highly recommends that a municipality under Title II form an ADA committee, which I'm in the process of doing that right now. And that ADA committee, half of it is supposed to be made up of persons with disabilities from the community. Why? Just what I said, because they live this every day. So they're able to bring the first-hand knowledge to the table and ideas. The other half is persons from the municipality, so finance, parks, public works, so that we listen to them and we collaborate together. I think it's the same process. If we ask people from the community, persons with disabilities, to bring their stories, we can learn from them. Thank you.
And Rob, I'm going to ask you between now and our next meeting to maybe write down your own notes of the folks that you could reach out to personally and send them the links along those lines. Shannon, to you. Either individuals, specific groups, or general communities, whose opinion, whose ideas, and whose stories would be helpful to you and to this group as we have these conversations?
Will you say that one more time? My mind switched off to something else. Would you say it one more time?
Absolutely. We've talked about running for and serving in office. We've talked about applying and working in government. Now we've talked about participating in public discussions. If we want to reach out and get more life experiences, more suggestions for solutions, or more stories about individuals' experiences on any of these topics, who are some of the groups of people or the individuals or the outlets where you think we should reach out and invite people to share their ideas with you?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for repeating your question. I appreciate that. For me and my group, the answer is easy. We have deaf organizations. They're already established, and it's easy to find with the Google search. We have the Colorado Deaf Association that has been established and is a great place for us to gather stories there. I'm not sure about how to connect with government agencies and things like that. I don't really know on that end of things, but I do know that there are other smaller groups of individuals and people that have those disabilities that we could get in touch with. They're often the minorities, and so I don't know what groups that there are that we can funnel those questions through.
And we lost Kim. I'm sorry. I'm going to go ahead and take over. 1 second. I was just saying that I find it odd that, if there's, for whatever reason, when we start the conversation, like if they'll say, well, there's deaf, agencies out there, there's deaf resources out there in the community, and people seem surprised by that. They don't realize that they're out there. But the deaf community does have its own organization or community agencies that they could reach out there. They are out there and available. So the good thing, I mean, I don't know, but I think that we also want to be an example for the disabled community. And really, to be honest with you, they don't reach out to the agencies for help with any questions or ideas. They don't seem to reach out to the community Like if they're, have a deaf child and they want to have information on how to handle that. So it's interesting because there's many resources out there that I'm not even mentioning tonight that people could reach out to. But I just don't see it happening.
Thank you, Shannon. And on one point, we are working to be able to access some existing state government employees to get their experiences. We want to make sure that we're respecting all of the proper channels there, but we are going to find some ways to get their stories and their input and ideas. Let me go to Craig and then Teresa and then Elizabeth. I do see your hand up, so I'll make sure I circle back to you. But Craig, Teresa, and then Elizabeth on this question of to whom should we reach out and who can you help us reach out to ask people to share their stories and their ideas?
Thank you. This is Craig. I think we should reach out to and utilize our independent living centers here in Colorado. We can reach out to the Center for People with Disabilities, and we serve 5 counties. And then there are 9 other independent living centers throughout Colorado that serve the whole state. So I think that would be a really good network to utilize to distribute a survey to the consumers that we serve.
Wonderful. Thank you. Teresa, your thoughts on whose opinions, whose stories, whose ideas do we need to solicit to help you all think about what recommendations you want to make?
Yeah, this is Teresa. I think it would be worthwhile to hear from employers in the government who have employed disabled staff members before. Piggybacking on Craig, I think to hear some more disability employment stories and or journeys, we should definitely consult with the Centers for Independent Living in Colorado, who can help us kind of get to the specific community that we're looking at. And I think lastly, talking to folks who have worked in government or are currently working in government, I think would be helpful. And sorry, those are folks with disabilities working in government currently and or before, to hear stories from. And I would say one more kind of group to add on there is just hearing from I guess each departmental ADA coordinator on what has been requested from them and what gaps in training or learning that they feel they need to be able to do their job well.
Some fantastic ideas, so we will consolidate these and get to work on them. Elizabeth, you had your hand up, and I'm sorry it took me a minute to get to you.
You're fine. Thanks for the opportunity. I can think of 3 groups here in Colorado that I think would be good for us to tap into. The first one is Speaking for Ourselves, SFO. It's a self-advocacy organization run by self-advocates, primarily with intellectual and developmental disabilities, but not exclusive to those disabilities, that is statewide. And so I think they could speak to not just the plain English, but the intuitive accessibility, and that should be incorporated into universal design when we talk about effective communication, but also for those individuals who live in fairly remote areas of different parts of Colorado, talking about the challenges they have with accessing any kind of government program, services, or activities. The 2 sort of groups that go in line with that are People First, which is kind of a subset of SFO. Sometimes those two groups are used interchangeably. And then there's an organization, a self-organization called SABE, Self-Advocates Becoming Empowered. And those are all groups here in Colorado that would be able to provide lived experience, real experience, to give it some context.
That is fantastic. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, everybody, for those ideas. We are coming right up on time, and although I always welcome public comment, I'm pleased today we got to continue the conversation uninterrupted by that, and you've helped us identify where to get some more public comment. In these last few minutes, I just want to share a little bit about where I think we are going to go next. And I need to say I think because part of what Carrie and I need to do is digest everything you've shared. And we now probably have about 30 requests that we need to get out so we can bring you back some information. We are going to continue to work and gather information on things like how the DPA, which is the Department of Personnel and Administration, how they oversee some of these processes. We're going to work with some of the departments to answer some of your questions about everything from the application to the hire or the interviewing, the hiring and the onboarding, some of the other questions that you've raised today about participating in public discussions. So we're going to spend the next few weeks gathering a lot of that information. At our next meeting as a subcommittee, what we will plan to do is continue this conversation around public discussions, informed by that meeting by some of the answers to the questions you've raised and looking at some of these checklists and other opportunities. We will also bring you a proposed set of questions to ask to some of these individuals and organizations you all have identified. Then we are going to start the fourth piece of our conversation, which is around ensuring that people with disabilities have access to the services they need. So I'll tee that up now for you to start thinking in advance of our next meeting. We will certainly send some follow-up emails with those topics. But just to recap, Carrie and I are going to be consolidating all of your ideas and all of the items you've identified where additional information would be helpful. We're going to start to draft the question bank to ask individuals and organizations to contribute their stories and their ideas. And we'll plan to kick off the conversation about accessing government services. We've got 1 minute if anybody has any final questions or thoughts. I see none. So what I will do is once again, truly thank all of you for your time generously donated and contributed to these conversations to make sure that Colorado doesn't set the floor, we set the ideal for what the world and the country should be doing when it comes to a Colorado for all. We can't do this without all of your thoughts, all of your expertise, and all of your experience. And we're truly grateful that you continue to give your time. Thank you also to the Lieutenant Governor's Office and to the Department of Regulatory Agencies who continue to provide immense support to all of that. With this, thank you very much. We'll follow up by email and we'll see you at our next monthly meeting.